모스트 포던 팟캐스트.
We should always also come to this topic from a point of view of humility, because I'm not a machine learning engineer. I don't know a lot about this stuff. So it's a lot of just like curiosity and learning. But I do think it's something that we have to address because it's on everyone's minds and it's something everyone has an opinion on. So why
Yeah.
not us?
Well, Libo, how often do you use AI?
We're using it right now. I think to record this podcast, or as Riverside advertises, it's helping us do transcriptions. It's helping us do editing, right? It's helping us do clips. But I also used AI a lot to do research for this podcast. I don't know if you used like Perplexity before. Now, OpenAI has released search on ChatGPT for everyone. But AI is becoming more and more powerful and more useful for these kind of tasks.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely feel it, like the so-called vibe shift that's happening in all these different sectors. I definitely feel like it's happening in my personal life when it comes to AI. It's like my go-to when I have a question. I don't go to somebody else. I don't go to my partner. I don't go to my friends. I go to my phone, open up ChatGPT, speak right into it and ask that question. And I think it's amazing. Like for the curious mind, AI has become an incredibly powerful tool to just learn about the world. Now, of course, it's a complex tool. And I think we want to talk about here is how it relates to what gets built, what gets made, how it relates to the industries that we're part of. But I think it's a moment right now, for those of you following the markets, AI has gone through a few shocks, especially due to the introduction of DeepSeek, but also just due to the compounding nature of a lot of the challenges and problems that we find in this world, trying to figure out what its role is going to be moving forward. I just finished Noval Harari's book, Nexus, where he talks about how AI is not really just a tool, it's an agent. It has agency and it can make decisions eventually for itself. And I think that's really the defining characteristic of AI versus, other tools that we've had in the past, digitalization, industrialization. We're definitely on a precipice of something new. So I think it's worth taking a moment this morning to talk about sort of where we stand and how we think this is going to affect the world. But I mean, Libo, you work with tech constantly. You're our sort of resident archi technician working at a major tech company and a self-trained coder. I mean, when you first encountered AI, what was your reaction?
So I think, we've all experienced chatbots, especially those of us kind of our generation who hopped on the internet very early. Like I think
Back
you
in
probably remember
AIM. Yeah,
Yeah, like Smarter Child, right? Was
exactly.
this
Yes.
early chatbot that had some semblance of like intelligence. And it's kind of going back to this like Turing testing, right? Like whether a machine can reasonably fool a human into thinking it's human. And I think before kind of GPT-3, there were some earlier tools that like help you write, help you complete words and things like that. And it was always a little bit off. You can kind of tell that it's not quite there. But I think with GPT-3, commonly, I guess, as we know, like ChatGPT, it really kind of surprised everyone just like how capable it was, right? You can give it problems, it would solve it reasonably well. You can help get it to write poetry. You can get it to express things creatively, and it's through this interface of language that feels very natural to interact with. And I think it would be hard to say that you don't get some very visceral feeling that you're talking to something that has a reasonable level of thinking and intelligence, even though it's just numbers and words kind of coming back at you in a probabilistic manner.
Yeah, I mean, what was amazing to me, my reaction was like, this is science fact, no longer science fiction. We've seen those sort of super intelligent computer models in movies and video games and books, and now you're experiencing right now. I think that, yeah, I was a child of the 90s too, and Smarter Child was definitely something that we played around with. It's kind of amazing back then, but and I remember when ChatGPT came out, I was like, well, isn't this the same as, that bot back in the day? But yeah, it isn't, because it can reason and it can kind of build upon the conversation, so to speak. So look, I think it's an incredibly powerful software. The opportunity is really evident, and it's no wonder that, a lot of these companies are taking off. At the same time, the pressure, the concern about its potential is also there. And, I mean, I think this is the question for our generation. How do we deal with this in the same way that the previous generation had to figure out how to deal with the internet? And so I think, to me, as a more of someone looking for solutions rather than just trying to poke out the problems, I think there's a lot of potential here. But, maybe we can break it down a little bit. I'm sure users are familiar with GPT. What are some of the other software and models that you think we should be aware of?
Yeah, so I think one thing to know is that like large language models, what ChatGPT is just one type of these kinds of models, like they've been used for a long time. Like, Teslas can have autopilot, like that's a version of AI and machine learning models. It's been used for quite a long time to return the right Google searches to you. It's been used quite a lot. Like the whole TikTok versus Instagram debate behind that is kind of a recommendation algorithm. And that is also one of these types of kind of AI models. I think also something that really captures the popular imagination of architects, especially, is something like Midjourney. So that's Stable Diffusion, a text to image model. And that's also kind of a similar architecture behind the scenes, but it produces kind of a different useful result.
Yeah, I mean, we talked to David Ho Lee about his work with Midjourney, and he's basically interacting with the console with text, with conversation, and producing images, which is extremely powerful too.
Yeah, I think it's one thing to treat this as a black box, and I think for most intents and purposes, it's useful to treat it as a black box, like its inputs and outputs. And if you get a useful output from your input, then great. But I think there's a second level, and I think we talk a lot when we talk about tooling and software, is if you don't understand how the software works, if you don't participate in the design and kind of organization of that box, you don't have agency over what it does. You're kind of subject to just feeding the right inputs in order to get the outputs out. You are, in a way, tailoring how you interact with information to the tool itself, right? So I think especially for architects and folks like us who maybe don't have as deep an understanding of these things as we can, it often leads us to a lot of misconceptions, a lot of fears, a lot of optimism that may be falsely placed because we think this black box is capable of something that it might not be, right? Like I hear a lot, it's like, oh, AI is just a cheap intern, right? Is it? Like, is it capable of doing the same things as a entry-level human worker, right? So I don't know, like in academia, like are folks talking about this? Like what is the general sentiment and a reaction to this current AI boom?
Yeah, I mean, just first off, I think one general rule of thumb, which is helpful on a personal level, is don't rely on AI for something that you can't do without AI. I think it's actually just on a personal level, like that's a good way of thinking about things, because if you don't know how to do it without the assistance of the computer, you're probably not going to make the best decisions along the way. And I think that's what, when I teach students, and by the way, it's year 2025. Midjourney's been out for about 2.5 years now. It's very evident. Like there's a lot of Midjourney. There's a lot of GPT in writing. I don't particularly assign a lot of writing assignments, but you can tell. And I think there's some aspects which are good. Like, look, if you struggle with English because it's not your first language and you're coming to America to learn, I think it's helpful to have GPT as someone who can basically like a writing tutor who can like correct things for you. I mean, I'm a native English speaker and I still use it all the time to just make my words sound more fluent, have something to talk back to and sort of get responses from. Where I think in design school, it's quite interesting is how students are trying and testing a lot of methods with Stable Diffusion, with Midjourney, with DALL-E, programs like that to create images of things. And they're trying to test the limits of not necessarily what the computer can do, but what is acceptable within the establishment. And I think that's probably the weirdest question right now, because look, design and style has always been dictated by a small group of people. I mean, and I think that's where sort of a lot of these institutions gain their power, is saying like, we produced the most influential architects of the moment. Therefore, we are an authority on what should be produced, what should be designed, how it should be designed, et cetera. And we're at a moment right now where the agency has left the architect in a lot of ways, and it's been given up to a computer. And to be quite frank, what I sense is a lot of fear. I'm just going to speak very frankly. I sense a lot of discomfort. I sense a great a feeling that we as an industry have lost a lot of agency and we continue to lose agency. And it's sort of expected. It's sort of understandable. I mean, it's a huge change for sure. And like you said, it's not quite the same as digital tools in the past. Like in order to use this, you don't have to spend a lot of time to figure it out. It's kind of like you just show up and tell it what you want. There is nuance, as Deho has mentioned. It's not that simple if you want to get good results. But I think that there's a lack of understanding right now as to how these things work and how they should work. And to be quite frank, I don't think that the producers of the models are the ones who feel like they should dictate that. It's kind of like sandbox, throw the toys in the sandbox and see what the kids do with it, which is how tech operates in a lot of ways anyway.
But I think that's honestly like what's the most exciting for me about this moment is like I think you read a lot is like progress, like 1 week in AI is like years of progress in other fields. Like new things are coming out constantly. People are deploying new techniques. You see amazing things all the time, like, text to 3D models, image segmentation. There's all kinds of crazy stuff that people are coming up with, which is incredibly exciting. And it's tough, I think, for me to see that we are not a part of the conversation, which I guess it's fine because we're not that technically capable of producing these models. But at the same time, it's discouraging that as an industry, we're quite fearful of what AI is, right? I don't think that same fear existed in previous technologies that have come that maybe, in my mind, has way more displacement power than the current iteration of AI that we see today.
Well, look, I think that you and I probably both agree on this, and this is maybe why we're friends. I think that it's not good to approach a moment of change from a position of defense. I think you need to be confident. And I think the only way to improve your confidence is to engage with the thing and see what's up. I mean, really, curiosity here is our best friend. And yeah, it's easy to think down the line, what are the third, fourth, fifth level of consequences for some of these things, especially in our current environment. It's easy to think that those are going to be extremely negative. But I mean, you can also, like, as I've said, every day I come up with a new use for these things. And especially when I think back in my life, actually just sort of like take a personal deep dive and like, where did I apply myself the most? Where did I spend the most hours of my life doing something? I can suddenly say like, hey, is there a faster way to do this? And not only could the technology be the solution for that, it could also be the person that tells me how to do things better, which just adds more, I think, richness to our lives, to our work, because we free up our most valuable resource, which is time. So look, I think it's a very interesting thing. And, we could do a podcast on AI every month, basically, as you're saying, like in terms of the evolution and the change that's occurring. So yeah, I think you're also mentioning, like, hitting on the fact that the time frame is very different from before. Like it used to be, let's say for 3D models, that sort of software, like you'd put out one version of the software and then maybe 3 or 4 years later, there'd be an improved version and there'd be a new group of people who are engaging with it. Now, like you said, it's every like 3 to 6 months that something else is changing. So I think we have to be comfortable with keeping up. But I don't know. I mean, you come from the tech field too. Where do you feel like AI is getting its most traction?
So I think maybe there's like a few layers, right? You can kind of think of it as the kind of the infrastructure layer. These are like the open AIs, Anthropics, Meta, like who build these foundational models. These are like extremely expensive to train. They're extremely powerful. But in order for you to do something with those models, you need to kind of have an application layer. This could be like the chat interface that you use for ChatGPT. Midjourney uses Discord famously as its interface. But there's this kind of secondary application layer. So right now, I think there's a lot of work happening in both. Like, how do we make these foundational models better? How do we tune them so they can reason better? How do we get them to improve their capabilities? And there's a lot of benchmarks out there. One of them is what's it called? MMLU, which is this big corpus of multiple choice questions that cover all these diverse topics. And one of the things they do is they test models against this multiple choice test and see whether it can score higher than the next model, whether it can score higher than the average human, whether it can score better than the expert human, so on and so forth. So that is kind of this capability layer. And then above that, there's kind of the application layer. So I think at Meta, you can see that if you use any of the products like Instagram, WhatsApp, Meta AI is a part of it. You can ask it questions. It can search the internet for you. It can make funny images of you if you ask it to imagine things. So that's kind of the deployment of that technology. So I think, for architects, I hope that we're able to kind of separate these two. It's like from a first principle standpoint is like, what is the infrastructural, the ground technology capable of? And then when you have that core capability, what is the application of that capability to something that's useful for you?
Well, I think that's a conversation that's happening right now. And I think it's happening a bit slower. I can't compare to other industries. It's really hard. Doesn't seem to be happening as quickly as it is in, let's say, finance or in or things like that. I find the conversation to be happening quite slowly. And maybe it's just happening on a more like personal level, like, what we're doing right now, as opposed to an institutional level. But I mean, it's when it comes to the built environment, like our customs and our habits are hard to change. I think I keep on going back to the stat that there's only industry that is less innovative than the construction industry is the fishing and gaming industry, something like that. Like we've been building things for the same way for the past centuries, and so
we're at the risk of being surpassed.
Well, I think that's where the fear comes from. And we talk about this anxiety that maybe is palpable. I do think it's not coming from nowhere. Like, I think we as an industry, whether it's architecture itself, design, or just construction. I mean, look at the sclerosis that we experience in terms of building houses in America. You know, we talked about it regarding the fires. We talked about it just regarding housing in general. Like, we're not really keeping up in the ways that we should. And so I also think there's an interesting question, which is AI really going to supplant, is it going to cause the virtual world to supplant the physical world as our primary domain of interaction? And that's a trend that's been happening just because of the internet, because of social media. But I think that's something where, you know, people are like, even on a psychological level, like, will you have a deeper connection with your computer than you will with your parents or with your childhood friend or with your dog or something like that, just because of the sort of intimate and accessible nature of this technology? So that's a whole nother set of questions. I mean, I think that, to be honest, I think that there hasn't been really a leader that has emerged within our field that has really stood up and said, this is what we're doing. There's people out there. Tim Fu out of London is doing something interesting with urbanism. I think a lot of these larger, more established firms too are adding some sort of AI technology component to their enterprise, probably because it's necessary just to fit in the market. But I'm interested to see who will come out.
I heard that in the Q4 earnings calls, 50% of companies mentioned AI in their earnings calls. So we are at this moment where everybody says that they're doing something with it, but whether that's true or whether that's substantiated, whether that provides value, that's tough to say and tough to validate.
Yeah, I mean, it could very well just be a corporate fad too, or like this feeling that, yeah, if I'm not part of those companies that mention AI, then my valuation is going to dip. You know, my investors are going to say, what's going on? I mean, you know, we talk about like Logitech, for instance. Every time I buy something, I buy a lot of peripherals for them for my office. Like, everything is AI enabled. What does that mean? I don't know. I mean, like, why do I need an AI microphone or an AI mouse or keyboard or things like that? But you see it all the time. I mean, I'm in San Francisco, right? And we see these are spaces that could be used for the next AI company. So, I mean, I think one connection we should make is the fact that it's really fueling the global economy right now. I mean, the amount of investment that is going into AI firms is off the charts. The amount of market capitalization that has been added to companies like Facebook, Microsoft, Google for AI, and most famously NVIDIA, specifically because they make the shovels and the picks and the hammers to actually create these AI or service these AI models, is insane. And that's really pushing forward a lot of this growth in the economy. So we're not financiers, we're not economists, but we do pay attention to those sorts of things. I do think that gives some sort of staying power in the culture, meaning like this is here to stay because there's value attached to it.
And I think unlike maybe the blockchain and NFT craze of a few years ago, it's a lot more tangible exactly how it brings value to our lives, right? Like, we are using it on a daily basis.
Yeah, it's useful.
I would argue like my NFTs are not doing much for me these days.
There's not a lot of marginal utility when it comes to NFTs. Definitely not.
Yeah.
No, I mean, yeah.
You know, my Tom Brady coin doesn't help anything.
Well, it certainly is one of those things that, yeah, you can see the value undoubtedly. And I think maybe it's a generational thing. I mean, you and I as millennials, like, we've gone from the analog era, you know, VHS, to, you know, the pre-digital, to the digital social media. Now this is the next step. It's very convenient for us to actually sort of level up. If I think about the generation behind us, I mean, in my class this year, I asked the students, I teach a class on image making. I asked students, have any of you ever taken a photograph on a film camera? And not a single one of them raised their hand. So they're pure digital natives. Like, they don't know what analog means, really. I think they know it from a sort of nostalgic, like 80s kind of, you know, Stranger Things kind of mentality, but not from a moment where they can say, okay, I remember when we didn't have that, and now I remember when we did have it. And now, I mean, even looking back 4 years ago, I'm like, wow, I remember when I didn't have GPT. I remember when I didn't have the software that was accessible and game changing. And even when I go to certain places, I travel to Hong Kong a lot, it's banned there. I can't use it. You feel it because you can't, you know, it's something that I use constantly all the time, and you're not allowed to use it there, which I think is also an interesting thing to bring up, which is the introduction of DeepSeek about, let's say it's about 2 weeks ago since the recording of this podcast. I sort of understand what DeepSeek is. I've played around with it. What I understand is it's kind of like GPT Lite, but can you tell me what the implications of that are?
Okay, so we're gonna have to go back a few steps to kind of get to that implication, but I do think that it's a very exciting moment to talk about it just because of what you mentioned before, the amount of money and resources being invested in this. So I think it's helpful for us to talk about how LLMs are trained in the first place. So LLMs stand for large language model. It's pretty much what it is. It's large language. Almost the entire corpus of the internet, books, everything being used to train this language model.
All that data gets consolidated, right? And then the computer is basically reading it, interpreting it, and then using that to teach itself?
Yeah, so in a general sense, yeah. I think one thing that would be that's interesting to note is in our conversation with Leland, right? Like we talked a little bit about language and how language is this way of communicating, a way of I think he said something like language is you reflecting like thoughts back to yourself. And I think that's where the large language model especially is so closely connected to our sense of machine intelligence is because it's speaking back to us. But kind of how it works is when I say a house is a machine for what do you think is the next word?
For living.
Right. So for you, right, because of your experience, because of your context, because of everything you learned, that is the next highest probable word to connect to that. So that's really what LMs are doing, right? It's just taking what came before, it's predicting what the next word is, and it just continuously do that kind of as a moving window. So you can imagine if I have an unimaginable amount of text that I can use that to train the model. All I have to do is say, hey, here are the first three words. A house is a, right? It could guess, big and it wouldn't guess machine, right? But if the next word is machine, I can say, hey, it's actually a machine. Let me tune the parameters a little bit so that the next time I give you the same three words, you'll get closer to the word that actually comes after it. And what's really surprising is in that simple mathematical process, by just training the model to predict the next word, you get these emergent properties like its ability to understand grammar, its ability to reason, its ability to solve problems. And all that just comes from, and the math is a lot more complex and I don't understand any of it. But these emergent properties come from that basic principle of just trying to predict the next piece of text.
I say, so it's a pretty, I mean, I guess it's similar to how we speak and how we learn, right? Like when we're growing up, when we're going from saying simple sounds to words to sentences, we're trying to figure out those patterns that can then create meaning down the line.
And what's really actually pretty amazing is so a lot of kind of the seed of this actually came from Google. So Google put out a really famous paper called Attention is All You Need. And I don't understand anything about that paper, but the general gist of it is that you can basically pump all this data into machines, and then it can figure out meaning and it can figure out kind of where these things belong in a mathematical space, and then it can use that to do language transformations, right? Whether that's translating from one language to another, like Google Translate is one of the origins of this piece of technology. It can predict the next piece of text, but the general gist is like you don't need a human to be in there and say, hey, like blue means this in English, it means this in Russian, it means this in Chinese, and they all have slightly different meanings. You just pump that text into the machine and it'll figure out where these pieces of meaning are. So what it does is when you read about these models, you hear a lot about how many billions or trillions of parameters it has. So these parameters are these dimensions of meaning. So there might be one parameter that's like maleness, right? On one end you have the word woman, on the other you have man, king, queen, so on and so forth. There might be another dimension that's like blueness, right? So think about breaking down language and sort of language tokens into 175 billion dimensions of meaning. It has that inherent power of like being able to interpret that. So that's part of the kind of scaling of these LLMs. It's GPT-3, 175 billion parameters. GPT-4 has 1.8 trillion. So by scaling up those dimensions of meaning, the ability for the model to embed what it's learning into these dimensions, you increase its ability to produce these second level effects like, reasoning and problem solving and things like that.
Interesting. No, I think that's the clearest definition of the LLM that I've heard so far. So all of this requires a ton of compute, right? A lot of power, a lot of energy. I guess data storage for a lot of the information that's going in. What's the current cost? Because I think that's where we're heading to when it comes to DeepSeek. They seem to be doing it more efficiently.
Yeah, so I think just some numbers. Of course, these are not like official numbers, but it's been said that GPT-3 cost around $5 to $12 million. It's trained on about 1,024 NVIDIA V100s, kind of an older generation of GPUs, and it took 34 days. Just to give you a sense of just like how this scales, GPT-4, the next generation, costs $63 to $78 million. And it's trained on V100s. and it took 90 to 100 days. So the scale is not linear, right? It's exponential to get to that next level of power. And when you use GPT-4 versus when you use GPT-3, like, do you feel that it's, a 5 to 10x leap in intelligence and power?
Not when I'm asking it like the definition of a word I don't know, or like how to translate something into a language, or any of these simple tasks that I think, we are just happy to have a straightforward solution for.
And I think that's where sort of the DeepSeek conversation comes in. It's like we are expending enormous amounts of resources to train these foundational models. Like, if we're not feeling tangibly that they're improving or getting to a significantly better result, right? Like, the world was pretty shocked on GPT-3, GPT-4, it's less shocking. And we've been long awaiting GPT-5, which really hasn't come out yet. And maybe part of the reason is that these scaling laws are hitting a wall. And that's where a lot of the conversation is like, is just pumping more compute, more power, more memory into training these models hitting a limit? Like, is this way of scaling model power reaching its limit? So what I think DeepSeek really helped understand is that there are engineering things you can do to make models more efficient. And that helps you achieve a similar result with way less resources. And the way that it does this is, I think the two major things that are novel, that are really interesting, is when you take GPT-4 and its 1.8 trillion parameters, in order to run the prediction, you have to turn all 1.8 trillion parameters on. So that consumes a lot of power, that consumes a lot of compute, and that makes it very expensive to run something like GPT. A technique that DeepSeek use is what they call a mixture of experts, I think. And what that does is it has, almost like how your brain has different parts that do different things, has different portions of the parameters do different things. So instead of turning all 1.8 trillion parameters on, it can turn maybe a few million here, a few million there, depending on the problem it's trying to solve. And the model can make decisions there. So what you get as a result is a model that seems equally as powerful, but is way less energy intensive to run.
Yeah. To use an architectural analogy, it's like using mini splits instead of central heating. You can locate, if you're in one room, you can just turn on the heat there instead of for the whole building.
Yeah. I mean, exactly. I think the other thing that's really novel, or not novel, but that technique that's been emerging is what they call distillation. And it's using a higher powered model to train a lower powered model in order to achieve a higher level of performance in that model. So we're getting to this point where you don't need more data, you don't need to train these foundation models over and over again, but you can actually use models to train each other and improve the performance of these models by just doing kind of model to model training, which is actually incredibly exciting, right? There's a lot of implications on the amount of data, copyrighted data, that LLMs consume. Meta was just accused of torrenting all the books available on the internet and not facing any copyright consequences, right? The whole joke is like OpenAI is accusing DeepSeek of using its IP to train the DeepSeek model, but OpenAI scraped the entire internet without paying any royalties in order to train its models. So it's kind of this shell game of like, where does the core knowledge really lie, and who really gets to take credit for what we have today?
Yeah, I mean, it's completely unprecedented, and it's there's a lot of philosophical debates and moral debates when it comes to that, as well as legal debates. No, but what I think is quite interesting, like you're saying, is that now these are becoming agents to improve themselves. And in that sense are quite like humans. Like when you identify that there's something maybe deficient in you, you say, I need to address this, I need to work on it. Then you actually have the capability to concentrate your focus onto that. It seems like some of these models are now saying, okay, here are the aspects of our entity that need to be trained, that need to be improved. And actually we can do that ourselves instead of relying on the creator, the overlord, I don't know how you describe them, somebody else to make that decision.
Well, I think foundation, it's about data, right? Like large language models consume enormous amounts of data, and it's kind of part of this thinking is more data better. And when you run out of data that is man-made, you turn into, I guess, machine-made data. So this is kind of that next step is like we've ran out of human-made data. Now we have to have machines make data to train machines. And I think what part of that reveals to us is like our industry is, as in terms of data maturity, is very low, right? We don't have a lot of data to work with. So when we talk about building models, when we talk about building AI, like what are we really building out of, right? Like what is the foundation, the data foundation? What are the inputs and outputs that we can actually use? And if you look at industries like medicine, finance, I guess like, geotechnical, like those industries have a much more mature data foundation that they can work off of. Like the predictive machine learning models being used in high frequency trading, like that's been happening for a very long time.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I mean, we've been talking about urban analytics, we've been talking about smart cities and smart buildings and things like that for a long, long time. Just, I think our intuition, having been in the AEC industry, is that there's people who talk about it, there's people who do it, but there aren't that many of them, maybe. And so yeah, just the amount of data that's available for some of this stuff to, I guess, affect AI is probably not as, robust as some other industries. And maybe that's why it hasn't been targeted
But it's
nearly
also
as
not
much
open.
as some of these other places.
But I think openness is also a big problem. And I think this is also what's quite exciting about DeepSeek is that it open sourced its model, right? The internet is pretty open. You're able to scrape it and get all of that data. There's a lot of these data sets for like image recognition, things like that are just out there, right? Anybody who's building a model can use these data sets to go into training, and it creates this really healthy ecosystem of like, hey, if I'm someone that wants to try something, I have most of the pieces that I need to put together in order to produce something new. I think that's very different for like what you said about like smart cities, like urban data, right? Like if I want to go out and say, hey, I want, traffic data for every city in order to build a model to predict, I don't know, how parking affects pedestrian density in downtown areas. Where would I even go? Like what data would I even look at? Like how would I even start to bring that problem and all the pieces of that problem to the table in order to build that model? It's probably going to take decades and a whole concerted effort in order to just get to that foundational point.
Yeah, probably because look, when it comes to a lot of the data that has been for the past decade or so been archived on the internet, been digitalized, like they've already gone through that step. Versus when you're taking information about a physical environment, there's a translation process between that physical environment to the digital, turning the outcomes of the physical into some sort of data that can be consumed. Which like as you're raising, like who's doing that right now? I'm sure there are some private enterprises that are looking at that, but at the end of the day, it's probably going to have to be authorized, like everything in the physical environment, by some sort of governing body. There's going to have to be funding allocated towards it. So yeah, I mean, maybe that's just something to be aware of. Like, is if cities and buildings and spaces want to be a part of this technological revolution, they also need to come to the table and understand what they're lacking when it comes to the information that's needed in order to do this stuff. I had never thought about that. It's fascinating.
And I think, in our conversation with Leland, like we talked a little bit about semantics, like what do drawings or spaces, what do these things mean? And I think that's something that we also don't necessarily have, right? We don't have a common baseline language that we use to talk about, to communicate design and physical spaces. That's quite different from natural language, where it's, been developed over millennia, right? We have some consensus agreement on how language works, and the machine's able to intuit that from the data. And that's how it's able to build all these dimensions of meaning. So let's say, I don't know, like 3D scanning is a pretty common technology. If we're able to 3D scan, all the cities, all the spaces, can machines intuit spatial meaning from XYZ color reflectance data? Like we don't know.
Yeah, I mean, there's other complication too, which is things change, right? And we've always talked about that when it comes to like digital twins, for instance, which I think we're going to be talking a bit more about this year. One sort of advantage of those is they can be dynamic with the changes that are happening in the physical environment. One disadvantage is that you can probably never keep up entirely with the reality. Unless we have a bunch of sensors placed all around a city, it's very hard to actually track what things are happening and what things are changing. And probably, in America, we haven't spent a lot of time doing that. There are other countries that have, don't need to name them. And maybe they might be at an advantage when it comes to using this technology, this AI technology, to basically make their cities better and make their places more efficient. Or, other I think rationale as well. But yeah, this is a new wake-up call, I think, in terms of what the impact of the so-called smart city, the sensor city, data city could be, because you now can actually apply that data to do something much more quickly and much more rapidly than previously. It's fascinating for sure.
I think you hit upon an interesting point about like surveillance and the prevalence of like these observation technologies, because like, image recognition is a pretty well-established kind of AI technology, and it's of course being used for surveillance. You know where people are, you know who goes where, but it's like where does that cross the line of being surveillance, and where is that data useful in order to produce, greater effects for cities because we understand things better, right? There is kind of that threshold where if I don't know, if I'm traced every moment where I go, like, sure, that may benefit our ability to create better cities, but is that too much information for a government, for a private institution to own without, say, being open to the public?
Yeah, of course. And I mean, I think when it comes to data about our personal lives, I mean, we've had this question for a long time. Do you give your health data to insurance companies? Do you give your spending data to retailers? Like all that kind of stuff. It's definitely something that we've had to encounter quite a lot. I think what is jarring is when you're saying like surveillance, like basically meaning when you're being watched, and especially when you're being watched and you don't know. That's a little bit concerning. But look, it depends on a couple factors to me. I think one is just, the culture of the place. Or is it more freedom oriented or is it more control oriented? I also think the level of trust in a society is extremely important when it comes to this. Oftentimes, trust is correlated with scale too. So it's a complex problem, and I would go on a limb. My take probably is that each country, each jurisdiction, each place has to decide for itself and make its own trade-offs. I don't think we're in a moment where we can say like, well, there's a one-size-fits-all solution for this sort of ethical problem. I really do think it's more specific and more local than that. But others might disagree. That being said, seem to be some advantages when it comes to the tech if you had that data.
Yeah, and I think that also kind of brings us back to kind of the whole DeepSeek conversation, where it's being seen in this lens of like this arms race between sort of the US and China, like who can build artificial general intelligence faster. And it's being portrayed in a way that's like very threatening. And I think I don't know, part of me thinks that it's being done in that way in order to drum up more investment for these companies. But if you think about, I guess, LLMs versus, say, like cruise missiles, it's a very different type of technology. There's much more net benefit to humanity to have LLMs versus to have, better missiles. So I think I would like to see a world where there's more things like Llama and DeepSeek, where it's open, where individuals can download these models, run it on their own hardware, and you detach this really exciting piece of technology from these structures of ownership and politics that exist. And with anything that comes out of China, especially with LLMs, the first thing people try to do is ask it, very sensitive questions.
Yes.
And the whole like jailbreaking, how to get, and like it's in the corpus text of training. So the LLMs know those sensitive topics. So how you jailbreak these LLMs to give you those answers back is, this whole like cottage industry that is kind of trying to pen test kind of these models. And actually, I'm really surprised that DeepSeek was able to release his model open source, right? Because once you download the model, you can do whatever you want to it in your own hardware, right? It's released from the grasp of the Chinese government, so to speak. And people have been able to extract knowledge about sensitive topics from that model. But I think that openness is really important, right? You produce this piece of really amazing technology, you put it out there in the open, and the world can now do what they want, innovate on top, investigate, understand, and really help our whole sort of corpus of knowledge improve.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what closed source AI is partially dangerous is that as it becomes more powerful, as it becomes more closed, does it concentrate power in the hands of the few at the expense of how we can all learn together?
Mm. Yeah, I mean that's a great way of putting it. I do think that there is a sense that technocracy is going to take over. I mean, we see tech's influence on politics right now. Don't need to go into that too much. And that leads to a lot of insecurity, no doubt. And that maybe, open source is a good thing. The other thing I want to touch on too is like when DeepSeek came out, Sam Altman tweeted, he welcomes the competition. And, a lot of people are talking about it as this Sputnik moment where it's more of this sort of like wake up call. How could they get to it first? And we know how the space race turned out. We know how the Cold War turned out. I think challenge can lead to a stronger conviction. I don't have a strong dog in this race necessarily, but I also empathize a lot. And I'm enlightened. I'm heartened by like your message too, which is like, look, if we can put these tools out there, who knows what good can be done with it. versus if you close them off, you won't know what bad can be done with it, basically.
Well, I think that's what I would argue is that like we all have a vested interest in this technology becoming one commoditized and two widely available. And I think we've already seen the effects of unequal access to technology, unequal access to services, unequal access to technology, and the effects that it produces in the world, right? It further distances the haves from the have-nots. And I feel like AI would just kind of crank this up to 1 million, right? If you have ChatGPT versus if you don't, if you have Google versus if you don't, right? Those are very different capabilities and heavily influence your ability to innovate, your ability to learn, your ability to have power kind of in this world. So it's a Sputnik moment in that the people who are raising tons of money want us to think it's a Sputnik moment. That way we kind of fall in line and kind of, I think, bring our perspectives into that Cold War mentality. When I think that's actually an incredibly dangerous way of thinking. Like it's not one country versus another, right? It's us all together exploring this kind of new horizon. And if we don't do it in this way where everyone benefits, we're going to kind of end up in the same place as we were before, where there's an enormous imbalance in who gets the benefit from this technology.
Well, look, I think if there's people out there who are trying to learn more about AI, where should they start?
So using AI would be a great place to start. You can ask ChatGPT, you can ask Perplexity, but there's a great channel called, I think, Three Blue, One Brown. It's this guy's like a effing genius. Like he wrote his own program to visualize mathematical concepts. And he does these like really amazing animated deep dives into how LLMs work, like what is the math behind it. And you don't really have to have like a deep mathematical understanding. And I think this is where your spatial reasoning actually really helps, is because everything is done in diagrams, everything done spatially, you can build that intuition of like, hey, this is how the underlying technology works. And I think that's especially important for people who think that AI is capable of being a entry-level intern, the AI is capable of producing designs for you, is once you kind of have an intuitive understanding of some of these core principles and how AI is able to produce these effects, it kind of helps you understand what boundary is around this bubble and how it can help your work, how you can maximize your utility from it, but also where, you're just kind of going down a dead end of saying, hey, AI is going to do this in the future.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I will definitely link to that in the comments down below. But I also just think of AI, like you're saying, as this curiosity multiplier. Like the only way you're going to understand it is by engaging with it. But that's the same with anybody, right? And the only way you're going to understand a subject is by engaging with it, understand an individual, understand a country or a language, whatnot. So, I hope that we're in a moment, to answer our own question, that we're in a moment where people are curious about things and are trying to learn and are trying to try things without fear of failure, without fear of things not working. I think that we need to really sort of engender a conversation where it's okay to try things on for size. And look, if it doesn't work out for one specific purpose, it might down the line. But, what I also think is fascinating, like you're saying too, is that this is a moment where we're also not just passive consumers. Like if I'm Google searching things, it's giving me something and it's giving me a response and that's it, like end of story. But with a lot of this stuff, especially the ones that are more text-based, that are more dialogue-based, like there's a back and forth and you respond to it. And I'm not saying that the value is like our response is helpful for their learning, for the AI's learning. What's helpful is the fact that it causes you to think and it causes you to respond. And that sort of thread will play out somewhere else in the world at some point. So, it's a bit like reading in that sense. Like the point of reading is not learning. The point of reading is actually to think more about things.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And it it is very different in that way, right? Like it's like you talking to a mirror versus like you talking to another person that is has the entire internet behind it to help you arrive at something. And it's incredibly useful for, I think, things like writing, things like just like going down rabbit holes. You just keep asking it deeper and deeper questions and it kind of fishes that out for you. For me, what's really great about it is it doesn't kind of break that rhythm, right? Like sometimes when you're Google searching, you're going down this rabbit hole, you come to a dead end, you can't find great resources, you're just like, ah, crap. Like, and then you spend 30 minutes searching, not a lot of result. But with kind of LLMs with Perplexity, like you just kind of keep going and it'll keep bringing things to the surface for you. And it's kind of this never ending joyride of curiosity.
Well, it's relentless. And it's like, when you're 4 years old and you're asking your parents, why is the sky blue? Why is this that? Why is that that? And at a certain point, they're like, can you just shut up? Like, I'm tired. I got to do other things right now. Like the LLM doesn't stop. And so I think that's also extremely powerful. Like, I used to say 5 years ago, like there's no reason not to be curious when we have all of the world's information in our pocket. Now all that world's information is like readily accessible, and actually it's much more gracious. The platform is much more like willing to give you that information than ever
Mhm.
before. So look, I think it's really fascinating. It helps us a lot produce things like this podcast. It helps us a lot in our own work. Yes, there are definitely considerations down the line that we can't be naive when it comes to thinking about this stuff. But at the same time, the only way you're
But
not
I think
naive
this
is
is a
if you
good
inform
point to
yourself.
raise, I think this is a good point to raise kind of just like one, our excitement, our just like general inability to be satiated by the amount of compute that we consume, right? Like we're just consuming
True.
more and more compute as we go on, right? Like this relentless nature of LLMs, behind it is a server somewhere consuming power, consuming water. And just to kind of like, some of our audience might be familiar with just how big data centers are, but just to give everyone a sense of just like how much we're consuming, data centers consume 4.4% of total power in the US right now. And with AI, it's projected to grow to 6 to 12% by 2028. So in 3 years. The $500 billion what's it called, Stargate investment that Trump just announced, a lot of that's going towards this, right? It's not going towards housing. It's not going towards improving conditions in cities. It's going towards building these giant warehouses full of processors consuming, 80 to 130 million gallons of water a year out in the middle of sometimes nowhere. And all of that is to power our consumption of, cat videos, pornography, and LLMs and the information on the internet. There is this balance, right? Like it's very exciting for us. It's very exciting that these tools are available, but there are this second level consequence of enormous waste in construction, enormous waste in water, enormous waste in power in order to produce this machine intelligence that we're consuming.
Yeah, and no, it's important that you bring that up because yeah, when you're sitting there on your phone in your bed and you're asking it like, why are apples green, or like how do you make a good Cobb salad, something like that. It's kind of my thinking. Yeah, you're not thinking about the cost basically because they're also delivering it to you for free. But yes, the physical cost is important, and I think that's one of the trade-offs that we're going to have to really figure out collectively. How do we manage this? And it's very nascent right now, but there is, at least in 2025, it does seem like energy, like a focus on renewable, clean energy, it's not just a cultural movement, it's like a commercial movement right now because of the things that you're talking about. Like if we could get to that, if we could find a source for that, you could really unlock a lot of potential and deal with that problem, the sort of the wastefulness and the destruction that being too consumptive affects, but also allowing us to unleash that curiosity and that potential. That I think, if I were to say, there's a lot of things going on in the world, but I do think it's definitely a vibe right now that people are, saying we do need to push this forward.
Yeah, and I think that's probably goes back to why a lot of this conversation is kind of coming from this Cold War, like arms race viewpoint. Because I think when you do talk about, a data center is equal to 3 hospitals worth of water consumption, right? It consumes as much water a day as a city of 30 to 50,000 people, right? And you do see all of these consequences for real people out there that don't have access to these resources. There is kind of this weird balance of like, okay, we're in this arms race spending billions of dollars to do this, but is it at the expense of what we could be doing for people? Like, is machine intelligence more important than human intelligence in a very broad way of speaking?
Yeah, well, that's a huge conversation that I think I have no response to. And to be honest, it's such a hard debate. And it's always been like, yeah, specific, like progress towards innovation and improving the future versus improving the present, so to speak. And I think it's tough. And, I think one concern I have is just like, are the people making those decisions informed? Do they know what they're talking about? And I think that's something that on a personal level, I'm trying to keep tabs on.
I mean, that's also an interesting thing to bring up because I think we live in a world where it's very tough to know what you're talking about. Because like we can have a conversation about AI, but I think, neither of us have a really deep grasp of how AI works, like how it's built, what are its true implications. And that takes like kind of a very expert opinion on how it works, right? But if you look at, the average US politician in their like late 70s, 80s, who's grown up most of their life without computer technology, who has like a bunch of aides running around who basically are their interfaces. And they're the ones who are making legislation, who are making laws about how we use this stuff, who has access to this stuff, where we can spend money on improving this stuff. You get the sense that like maybe we need better education and better understanding from a governance level on some of these impacts. Because I think this is also where I find it quite risky that the people who stand to benefit most from this investment are the people who are advising our government on how this should move forward. And I think the conversation about whether we should regulate the development of AI and whether we should regulate the size of models is potentially quite dangerous because it's regulatory capture, right? Like the people who got there first got there, and then they just regulate everyone else out of the competition.
Yeah, that's definitely a situation. There's no doubt about it. I know that term, regulatory capture. That's not part of my like everyday vocabulary. But yeah, I mean, look, a couple things. One, the gerontocracy is real. You hit on it. Like politicians keep on getting older for some reason. I'm not going to go too far into that. But yeah, especially when you're talking about making decisions on technology that, again, they probably don't have a lot of interaction with on a day-to-day basis. It doesn't seem appropriate in a lot of ways. I'll just go on a limb and say that. I know we try to avoid politics right now, but it does seem like, you're either listening to the person who's completely invested in it and is like their whole life is sort of staked on the success of this one technology, or you're listening to somebody who doesn't really know and doesn't really care and maybe is just benefiting from their stocks like Nancy Pelosi is right now. Yeah, I mean, it is a very strange moment. And I do think that in addition to the maturity of the technology, which we're saying is happening really rapidly, I also think that there's going to have to be a maturity in terms of how we regulate and govern a lot of this stuff too. And to be quite frank, I think that the current, let's say, the current body of people who are dealing with that right now are not the ones who will ever be able to deal with it. It's just, how many times have we heard from somebody of a previous generation, I don't know how to do this. I don't know. I didn't grow up using a computer. I didn't grow up using a phone. So it's hard for me. Well, guess what? Yeah, it is hard. And maybe that means you shouldn't be the one who's making these decisions. So I do think that that's going to change a little bit too, just as, people our age start to mature a little bit into our 40s and 50s when you are sort of electable. But there is also a discussion about like, do people vote for you because you know how an LLM works? No. I mean, they vote for you based on what you can tell them you're going to provide for them. So, there's always been this disconnect between politicians and the policies that they make. I mean, we talk about it actually in our world, like in the physical environment. Like there are very few politicians who are actually developers. There's one very famous one. And there's a few, but like most people making decisions on housing have never built a house. They've never developed housing. They don't know how the complexities of the situation. They hopefully should understand the ramifications, but that's not even guaranteed either. So it is just one more of those items, I think, that adds to the richness, but also the challenges of our democratic society. And I'm quite excited about it because at least it makes things easier. I'm a more of like a futurist. I like things that seem exciting and give me energy,
I think that positivity is important. And I think maybe in this moment, it's actually quite exciting because everyone does get to have an opinion about it because everyone is able to use the technology, right? You don't have to go through this boot camp. You don't have to like train. You don't have to like hire someone to come and teach you how to do this. You just open up a browser, type some stuff in, and then you're using the technology. So the barrier to entry is very low. And once you experience it, you have that at least first step understanding of how it impacts your life, how you could potentially think about it.
Yeah, I agree with you, Libo. But I also say I'm just going to advocate for our own generation. I think that there's limits to that. Like you can go in and start typing away, but like you said, if you don't know how these things work, if you don't know what the software is based on, what the previous version of this was, what it was like before that, you're not really going to get the most out of it. So I do think it's an extremely exciting moment in our world. I mean, it's fueling a lot of energy. It's fueling a lot of anxiety as well, which is, I mean, it's fine. But I mean, I'm looking forward to seeing how this connects and makes the physical environment better in particular, and just, hopefully makes our society a little bit more cohesive.
Well, I guess I do have a question for you, since you are involved in, I guess, a lot of the conversation in academia, kind of at the forefront of where a lot of these things are happening. Like, do you see a sense that the design world wants to be a little bit more connected to the technology world? Like, are people reaching out and maybe collaborating with the folks who are at Harvard, at MIT, who are developing these like frontier technologies in order to be a part of the conversation, have a better understanding of how these things work in order to incorporate that into kind of the next generation of design? Or are those two sides not talking?
Well, I'm worried a little bit that design is going to continue to be that just like cool friend that shows up at the parties and is like fun to have around and talk to and has traveled and wears fancy clothes, but doesn't actually know what they're doing. Like I imagine, what's happening at high-end research institutions is that, and I know from one side of this that, the technology is being developed in the computer science labs. It's being developed by the engineers. It's being developed by the economists and the scientists basically. And design is constantly looking for a way to engage with them. But there's always been that disconnect between the doers and the sort of like the people who are making the thing and the people who want to use it. I mean, it's the same thing actually with climate. For the past 10 years, design saying we need to be more climate focused. We need to advocate more for climate. But they haven't really I'm talking about design establishment, and this is coming from the high end architecture schools and these institutions, but also like architecture firms. Like unless you focus on that, unless you build on that, and that really becomes your like central identity, it's very hard to just be like, well, I'm going to touch on that and I'm going to find ways to make it relevant and this and that. I think there's a lot of group psychology there. It's like some people don't want to have their credit taken for them. Also, I think it's a bit of a naivete that, somehow let's talk about climate. Like designers can address climate better than the scientists or better than the engineers or better than the policymakers or the economists or anybody else. And I really do worry this. I'll put this out there. I do worry that it's getting worse because of a couple of things. One is the gerontocracy that I'm talking about. Formally important people who continue to think that they need to be relevant when they just don't have it anymore. I mean, to use a technical term, they're cooked in a lot of ways. QOOKD, cooked. They don't know what they're talking about, but they want to be involved. And the problem right now with the institution is, like I said at the beginning of this episode, a lot of times students who are the ones who are actually advancing these things and are actually trying and testing these things, they're not looking at the technical outcomes. They're looking at the response from the people in charge who are going to grade them or who are going to assess them or who are going to elevate them, promote them to a job, recommend them here or there. So there is a structural and sort of power imbalance that I think is quite destructive. It's not very helpful. I think that what's really going to make a difference is the type of people, and this has always been the case, the type of people who say, I don't care, I'm going to do this because I think this is important, and they're going to get, I guess, not excommunicated, but they're going to have people who naysay them and doubt them and poo-poo their work. And then at one point, they're just going to like reach escape velocity and they're just going to bypass that all and they're going to look back and say, see you later. I think that you see that in development, you see that in some designers as well. I think that there's just unfortunately a nagging like pessimism in design. I think this comes from, again, a state of instability and a worry that agency is just not there anymore. But the response is not to take everybody else down to make yourself feel good. The response is to build yourself up so that you can actually acquire these skills. So it's a very pessimistic way of looking at this, but it's not new, to be honest. And maybe this is why you and we often have these discussions about where agency actually lies these days. If we just take the example of like Midjourney, I think there's a lot of people worried that there is going to be some kid who doesn't have to go to architecture school, who doesn't have to go through training. They're going to type in, I want this type of building. I want a neoclassical palace. And they're going to be able to approach clients and win commissions that way. And, it's going to be hard for people currently in the profession. It's also going to be, I guess, against the aesthetic that the establishment establishes is right. So, but again, I mean, like what you're saying, it's open source. Anyone can do that. So if you have a certain position, if you have a certain worldview, like it's up to you to actually go out there and make that happen. But yeah, I don't have a lot of confidence that AI and things like that are really being integrated seriously in a meaningful way quite yet. I think it's going to be much more grassroots and come from people who you wouldn't expect.
And I think maybe that's something that was helpful for us to, one, have this podcast, talk to a huge variety of people, but also kind of be in touch and have these conversations with a lot of people. Because one of our mutual friends, I think Reggie, he's doing a really great job from a grassroots perspective of incorporating this into practice, right? Yeah, he recently won a competition using Stable Diffusion as a partial tool to complete renderings. And it's 80% there. You're still doing the last 20% through traditional methods, but your ability to get to that stunning visualization in a short amount of time is very quick. And what they're really able to do is really compress the time for design production of that final result in order to spend more time on design. So you are seeing the people with the capability, the people with the know-how and the awareness of where it fits in start to incorporate these things in very powerful ways to really great effect.
Yeah, I mean, shout out Wong Architects, Reggie Wong out in Taichung in Taiwan. Yeah, I just met up with him last week and he was showing me some of the work. And I think what this also hints at is the fact that, especially in design and architecture, like it's still a service, right? You still have to get clients, you still have to reach a market. And unless you are forced to actually engage with that market and get their reaction, I really feel like it's difficult to actually make some sort of impact. So yeah, maybe it's going to be more the practitioners who realize like, this is important. This is going to make my bottom line more efficient. This is going to allow me to engage more frequently with and productively with clients. This is going to allow my team to be more productive and happy. Like we talk all the time about how architects work like crazy. Like, I mean, and I think there's always going to be a middle ground. It's not like we can just eliminate all those hours doing sort of rote tasks. But yeah, I do think that it's the ones who are forced to do that for their own survival that are going to make the change.
And I think that is maybe a piece of optimism to end on, right? Is like we do, as architects, work a lot of hours, but hopefully through better leveraging technology, we can make more of those hours good hours, like hours spent doing design and problem solving and the things that we really care and want to do, and hopefully have a better effect on our work and what we put out in the world, right? So, it's not
Yeah.
either or, right?
Absolutely. Again, the most valuable resource we all have is our own time. And so if we can just reallocate 2 hours a day over a year to doing something more productive, adding more creativity, adding more interest, getting more work, writing something more influential, I think there's a lot of power in that too. So that's why I'm optimistic, no doubt. Anyway, Libo, this has been a really interesting conversation. I think we should continue to talk about AI and how it influences things and hopefully get guests on who can speak to it with a higher level of expertise than you and I can. But I hope that our listeners have found that at least this elucidates some of the mystery behind it. And I encourage everybody to use it.
Yeah, and maybe like if you're listening and you're like, hey, I have a question, or I hope you guys talk about this, or can you guys find a guest on, so on and so forth topic, like please email us at mostpodernpodcast@gmail.com. We're always there. So, happy to kind of take this podcast in a direction that you guys want to go.
Most Podern.
Most Podern.
Most Podern.
Most Podern. 모스트 포던 팟캐스트